Just a stock clerk. That's what Gerald Sterling called her in the break room on her 8th month at Morrison's grocery in Savannah. Not to her face. Never to her face. But loud enough for the others to hear, loud enough for the words to travel through the produce section and stick to her like fluorescent lit shame. Danielle Ross wore the blue Morrison's vest and the name tag that identified her by first name only, and no one who passed her in aisle 3, restocking cans of black beans with the precision of someone placing surgical instruments, had any idea that the hands moving across those shelves had once held a soldier's carotid artery between two fingers while rounds cracked overhead like angry hornets. They didn't know. He had no idea either. Sterling, with his management degree from a state school and his 15 years of accumulated authority built on the backs of people who needed the job more than they needed dignity. He had constructed a careful hierarchy at Morrison's, the assistant managers who feared him, the cashiers who smiled when he passed, the stock crew who moved faster when his shoes clicked across the tile. And then Danielle arrived, quiet and capable, and something about her presence, the way she moved through the store, the way customers somehow found her when they had questions, began to erode the ground he stood on. It started small. A woman in her 60s approached Danielle near the pharmacy section on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 months in. The woman's hands trembled, her speech slightly slurred on one side. Danielle was rotating stock on the lower shelf, her movements economical, her breathing steady. She looked up. 47 seconds of observation. That's all it took. When did the numbness start? Danielle asked. The woman blinked. This morning. How did you? Get to the ER. Now. Tell them you need a CT for stroke protocol. Danielle stood, and her voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Tell them you noticed it at 6:23 a.m. The time matters. Go. The woman went. The hospital confirmed a left middle cerebral artery occlusion, caught within the 3-hour window for thrombolytics. She recovered 89% of her motor function. Her daughter brought her back to Morrison's a month later specifically to thank the stock clerk, hugging her in front of the cereal section, saying her mother's name like a prayer. By then, the story had spread through the neighborhood like electricity through copper wire. Sterling heard about it during his morning meeting with the district manager. Not as a good deed. As a problem. 3 more customers approached Danielle over the next 6 weeks with medical questions. A man who asked about chest pain that felt like someone sitting on his ribs at 2:13 p.m. on a Friday. A teenager who described migraines that made one eye go dark. An elderly woman who mentioned blood in her sputum. Each time, Danielle gave them information that was precise, actionable, delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had spent years reading the body's distress signals in places where the margin between correct and fatal was measured in minutes. Sterling watched the pattern crystallize. He called her into his office on a Wednesday morning when the store was quiet, the fluorescent lights humming their sterile song overhead. His desk was organized, nothing on it but a nameplate and a pen, both positioned at exact right angles. He looked at her across that expanse of laminated with the way a man looks at a crack in the foundation he thought was solid. I'm concerned about the liability, he said. His voice was the tone of someone reading from a script he'd written during a sleepless night. We've had multiple incidents where you've provided medical advice to customers. Customers, I might add, who came to you or a stock clerk instead of seeking professional help. That's a problem. Danielle stood in front of his desk, her hands at her sides. She was 42 years old, and her medical license had been revoked by federal order. Her Navy credentials, 19 years of service, decorated through 3 combat tours, cited for valor in Helm and Province, existed in a classified Pentagon file that bore her name crossed out in red marker with a single typewritten line, deceased. Case closed. She had been ordered to disappear into the American civilian landscape like a ghost, told never to surface in any medical capacity, never to claim her credentials, never to acknowledge the life she'd lived before the extraction went wrong and someone decided it was easier to bury her entire identity than to explain what happened at FOB Chagazay. She drew one breath. Measured. Controlled. I provided no medical advice, she said. Her voice was soft, but it had the quality of someone who could make themselves heard across 100 yards of desert. I made observations and suggested they seek professional evaluation. That's observation, Mr. Sterling. Not practice. That's not how I see it. He leaned back in his chair, and something shifted in his expression, the moment when a man realizes he has found the lever to move something he thought was immovable. And I'm not the only one. I've spoken to corporate. They're concerned about our liability profile. I'm putting a formal write-up in your file. And I'm reassigning you to the night shift, effective immediately. You'll work 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., third crew only. That should reduce the interaction with customers. There. He'd said it. The punishment wasn't about safety. It was about visibility. It was about removing her from the sight lines of people who might ask her questions and inadvertently reveal that someone working in his store knew more about emergency medicine than he ever would. Danielle absorbed this without flinching. She simply nodded, a small downward tilt of her chin that could have meant acknowledgement or nothing at all. She turned toward the door. And Danielle, he said. She paused, her hand on the doorframe. I'd prefer if you didn't discuss medical matters with staff in the break room either. That kind of talk is unsettling. We're a grocery store. Not a clinic. She left without responding. The night shift began on Friday. That same Friday, a classified phone call came through to a Pentagon office in Arlington, Virginia. A senior advisor to the President's Chief of Staff, an Army Ranger named James Holloway, 73 years old, with a scar that bisected his left temple and eyes the color of burned coffee, had been admitted to St. Mary's Hospital in Savannah for chest pain. Routine workup. Routine everything. Except he'd had a moment of clarity in the cardiac observation unit when the ceiling tiles began to spin and the fluorescent lights felt like they were closing in, and he'd found himself transported back 18 years to a forward operating base in Helmand Province where the medevac helicopter was down and the medical officer had been killed, and a petty officer with blood under her fingernails and apocalyptic calm in her voice had kept a platoon of Rangers alive for 11 hours with field supplies and prayer. He'd asked the cardiac nurses if there were any Navy personnel on staff. They'd said no. He'd asked if anyone working in the hospital had military medical training. They'd said they'd check. What they didn't know, what no one would know until a single phone call changed the institutional memory of his visit, was that he'd made one phone call of his own to a contact in Savannah, asking about a woman with a certain set of skills, a woman with eyes that had seen the worst and hands that had learned to save anyway. The contact told him Morrison's grocery. Night shift. A stock clerk named Danielle Ross. Holloway had almost smiled then. Almost. And that's when the real nightmare began. The Pentagon file that had buried Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross for the last 18 years was sitting on the desk of a very powerful man in Washington, D.C. A man who had just learned that his senior advisor had survived his cardiac event because of a woman who was supposed to be dead. A woman he had just found, by accident, in a grocery store in Georgia. A woman whose classified clearance had never been officially revoked because the paperwork to revoke a deceased person is redundant. And on Monday morning, when she stood in the rain at Bonaventure Cemetery with her hand pressed against a granite headstone bearing the name Marcus Ross, with the stone cold under her palm and her throat locked against a sound that wanted to come out, she would still have no idea that the machinery of a federal government was already beginning to turn in her direction, that telephone calls were being made at levels she couldn't imagine, that her 16-year-old son Cameron was about to walk into a grocery store manager's office with a shadow box full of medals and a single sentence that would shatter everything Sterling had built. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she was about to be asked to stop being invisible. And she had no idea if she was ready. The employee break room at Morrison's grocery smelled like stale coffee and something else, the particular staleness that comes from a space no one actually wanted to occupy. Danielle sat at the scarred plastic table, unwrapping the turkey sandwich she'd brought from home, when the door swung open and 3 stockers from the afternoon shift filed in. They were loud, the way people are loud when they're performing normalcy. They grabbed their lunch containers from the refrigerator, laughed at something on a phone screen, and then Marcus, the one who usually nodded at her, glanced up and saw her sitting there. His expression flickered. Not unkind, exactly. Just calculated. He exchanged a look with the others. Within 8 seconds, all three had gathered their things and left the break room, leaving behind the echo of a door closing with deliberate softness. She didn't flinch. She didn't set the sandwich down. She simply continued eating, one careful bite after another, as though the room had always been empty. This was the 3rd time this week. Gerald Sterling had achieved something small but corrosive. He'd made her presence feel contagious. The unspoken directive had traveled through the store like a virus. Don't sit with her, don't acknowledge her, don't risk being seen as one of the weak or the ambitious or whatever category she'd been assigned to. The thing that made it work was that Sterling had never explicitly ordered it. He'd simply made it clear through a series of micro-expressions and strategic reassignments that the cost of her friendship was his attention. And his attention, once withdrawn, was a form of punishment no one wanted to experience. 2 days earlier, at 11:38 a.m. on a Wednesday, everything had accelerated. An elderly man had collapsed between the milk coolers and the yogurt, his body suddenly unresponsive while his wife stood screaming his name into the fluorescent-lit air. Danielle had been restocking canned beans 3 aisles over. She heard the wife's voice, the particular timbre of panic, and moved toward it without thinking. Her hands had already assessed the pulse, checked the airway, noted the deviation in his smile before her mind caught up with what her body already knew. Stroke. Left side involvement. The window for intervention was already narrowing. She turned to the wife, voice calm and measured. We need to call 911 right now. How long has he been unresponsive? The wife had said 2 minutes, maybe 3, and Danielle had begun noting the time, beginning the protocol in her head, last known well, symptom onset, the cascade of decisions that would determine whether this man's brain was being starved of oxygen. A customer had overheard. A tall woman with shopping bags on both arms had watched Danielle's hands move through the assessment, had watched her face, and something in that expression had triggered recognition. You're a medical professional, the woman had said. Not a question. A statement of fact. And Danielle, who had been trained to survive through invisibility, had made a critical error. She had answered honestly, I've had medical training, yes. Let's focus on your friend here. It was the moment everything began to calcify. Sterling had arrived while the ambulance was still pulling away. He'd taken in the scene, the elderly couple being loaded into the back, the gathering of concerned shoppers, Danielle standing with her hands at her sides, her breathing steady, and something in his face had shifted into a geometry of pure calculation. He'd said nothing that day. But by the next morning, there was a printed notice on the employee board in the break room. Her name was listed. The violation was printed in Sterling's own precise handwriting, employee Danielle Ross, unauthorized practice of medicine without a license. Customer report filed regarding overstepping a position and advice given regarding medical condition. Maintain professional boundaries. This is a formal written warning. It was beautifully, systematically cruel. The notice was there for every employee to see during shift change. The language was crafted to make her sound delusional, ambitious, dangerous even. And it was posted in the presence of the family whose patriarch she'd tried to help. They'd come back to Morrison's to buy flowers before visiting their father at Savannah General, and they'd seen the notice. The father had survived the stroke. She would later learn he'd regained most of his mobility. But that morning, looking at his daughter's face as she read the board, Danielle had felt something crack internally. She'd simply kept working. That was the composure that Sterling didn't understand. It wasn't strength exactly, it was the opposite of it. It was the ability to absorb humiliation and convert it into forward motion. She'd collected the notice with a steady hand, read it without her expression changing, and then returned to the produce section to finish rotating stock. One measured breath in. One measured breath out. She didn't cry. She didn't defend herself. She didn't seek out Sterling to explain what had actually happened. The absence of reaction was itself a kind of resistance, though she wasn't sure against what anymore. But the break room exits continued. The avoidance became systematic. A new routine established itself with the efficiency of a supply chain. Sterling had created the architecture, and the rest had followed with minimal prompting. The break room became a place she took her lunch now, arriving when she knew it would be empty, eating quickly, leaving before anyone else had the chance to perform their synchronized departure. 3 days after the written warning, the real emergency came. It was 2:17 a.m. on a Friday, and the store was almost empty, just Danielle and Marcus working the night shift, rotating stock that would be shelved by morning. The fluorescent lights hummed their particular frequency, that sound that exists only in empty stores late at night, that noise that somehow makes silence louder. She was reaching for a box of cereal when she heard the thud of something heavy hitting the ground on aisle 6. Not merchandise falling. Something organic. Something human. She moved toward the sound without thinking. Marcus was already there, standing paralyzed over an elderly man lying crumpled between the soup and the pasta sauce, his face slack, his right arm hanging at an angle that suggested something had catastrophically gone wrong inside his nervous system. The man was breathing, but barely. His eyes were half open, unseeing. She dropped to her knees in one smooth motion, already running diagnostics, respiratory pattern, skin color, pupil response, her hands moving like they had done this 1,000 times because they had. "Call 911, she said to Marcus, who was standing completely still. "Now." She didn't wait for confirmation. Her hands were already assessing the tension in his chest, the shallow desperate breathing, the way the man's body was failing to maintain even the basic mechanics of existence. Tension pneumothorax, her mind said, and her muscle memory responded before her conscious thought caught up. She'd treated this exact injury in FOB Shigase in 2013, with improvised materials and the sound of mortars landing close enough to shake the walls. The protocol was the same. Only the setting had changed. She pulled off the man's shirt collar with both hands, felt the position, found the second intercostal space with the precision of someone who had done this in darkness with hands that had been shaking. There was a ballpoint pen on the floor, someone's lost inventory tool. She grabbed it without hesitation, removed the ink cartridge, and positioned it at the landmark. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping. His breathing changed immediately, deepened, became less desperate. The man's eyes focused suddenly. They locked onto hers with absolute clarity. And he said something that made her entire nervous system go still. "Oi Helmand. You were the medic at FOB Shigase. I watched you work." She'd held his gaze for exactly 1 second, then looked away. "You're confused from the pain," she'd said, her voice one measured octave. "I've never left Georgia." She'd kept her hands moving, assessing, preparing, refusing to acknowledge what he'd said or what it meant. The sirens were already audible in the distance, growing closer. 1 minute out, maybe 90 seconds. That's when Sterling appeared at the end of the aisle, drawn by the commotion, taking in the scene with his eyes. The old man on the ground. Danielle's hands on his chest. The improvised needle. And the expression on Sterling's face had shifted into something beyond anger, something closer to panic, as though he could see his entire architecture of control crumbling in real time. "What are you doing?" Sterling's voice had cut through the air like something sharp. "Get away from him. Get away. You're assaulting this customer. I'm calling the police." Danielle had looked up at him without moving her hands. His lung was collapsing, she'd said quietly. "He's breathing better now. The ambulance is 3 blocks away." "You have no medical authority here," Sterling had said, his voice rising now, performing the emergency for the EMTs who would soon be walking through that door. "This is assault. This is practicing medicine without a license. And it ends now. You're finished. Finished. The consequences of your delusions of grandeur just became very real." She had simply continued what her hands were doing, checking the patient's oxygen saturation with the clarity of someone who had held lives together in conditions infinitely worse than a grocery store at 2:17 a.m. One tear had escaped down her cheek, just one, just that, the kind of tear that comes not from emotion but from the physical release of tension, and she had wiped it away without breaking eye contact with Sterling. The ambulance arrived 60 seconds later. The EMTs had assessed the scene in under 20 seconds and had loaded the patient with the kind of speed that suggested they understood the situation exactly. As they wheeled him out, the man had looked back at her once, his eyes carrying something like recognition. Or maybe like grief. Sterling had stood in the fluorescent lights of the empty grocery store at 2:17 a.m. on a Friday, his face dark with something that looked like rage but felt like desperation, and had begun making plans that would echo far beyond Morrison's grocery. The phone was already in his hand. The calls were already forming in his mind. And Danielle, still breathing steadily, still holding her composure with the weight of 18 years of practice, had already begun preparing herself for whatever came next. But she didn't yet know that the old man in the ambulance would be making a phone call of his own. A call to someone very high up. A call that would eventually reach all the way to the White House. And that this single moment in UL6, this moment of her training breaking through the walls she built around it, had just initiated a chain of events that no one, not even Gerald Sterling with all his institutional power, could stop. The elderly man's hand trembled as he reached for a carton of milk near the dairy section, his fingers brushing the cold steel of the refrigerator case. He was maybe 75, weathered face like a map of desert campaigns, shoulders still broad despite the years pulling at his frame. He moved down the aisle with the careful precision of someone whose body had learned the language of pain. Danielle was 3 aisles over, restocking soup cans, when she heard it, that specific sound. Not a fall. A collapse. The kind where the body gives out all at once, where breath leaves before impact. She knew that sound the way soldiers know incoming fire. She was moving before her conscious mind caught up, muscle memory overriding the 8 months of invisible she'd been maintaining. He lay on his back near the dairy, his lips already taking on a grayish tint. His breathing was shallow, labored, each inhale a desperate pulling of air that never seemed to fill his lungs. Around him, shoppers froze. Someone screamed. A manager, not Sterling, thank God, was already on his radio calling 911. Danielle dropped to her knees beside him, her hands already assessing. Trachea deviated. Breath sounds absent on the left. Distended neck veins like cords of rope pulling upward. She didn't ask permission. She didn't introduce herself. Her hands moved like they'd been waiting 8 months for this moment, and now they were finally allowed to remember what they knew. I need a needle. Large gauge. Anything. Now, she said to the manager hovering above her. Who are you? Are you a... Now. The word wasn't loud. It was the kind of quiet that stops arguments. The manager ran. She unbuttoned the old man's shirt, her fingers finding the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the landmark burned into her muscle memory from 1,000 hours in trauma bays that officially didn't exist. His skin was cool, papery, slick with the sweat of a body suffocating from the inside. Tension pneumothorax. She'd seen 3 in her career. 2 had survived. The one who didn't would be why she woke up at 3 a.m. for the next 4 years. The manager returned with a sewing kit. Danielle grabbed the largest needle, nowhere near appropriate, too thin, but it was what existed in this moment in a grocery store in Savannah. She'd worked with worse. She'd worked with things Sterling couldn't imagine and lived to stock shelves about it. This is going to sound wrong, she said to the old man, meeting his eyes for 1 second. It's right. She positioned the needle perpendicular to his chest wall, felt for the anatomical landmarks, and advanced it through the skin. The resistance changed. Muscle. Rib. Pleura. Then. The hiss of air escaping. Immediate. Unmistakable. Like opening a pressurized valve. His body's shoulders dropped 2 inches. His breathing eased. Color began returning to his lips like someone turning up a dimmer switch. Shallow became deeper. Desperate became almost normal. ETA 5 minutes, someone said into a radio. The old man's eye stayed on her face, and she saw recognition flicker across his features like a match striking in darkness. His hand moved with surprising strength for someone seconds away from death, grabbing her wrist. His grip was military firm, trained. Helmand, he whispered. You were the medic at FOB Chagazay. I watched you work. November 2009. You held that casualty's abdomen together for 40 minutes while we waited for the medevac bird. Kept him talking. Singing, actually. You sang some old Navy drinking song. Her hand was still on the needle. Her heart made one hard beat against her ribs like it was trying to escape her chest. She knew exactly which casualty he meant. Knew exactly which song. Knew exactly that Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross was supposed to be dead, her records classified into a Pentagon black hole where no one was supposed to find her. She took one measured breath. Held it. Released it through her nose. You're confused from the pain, sir. I've never left Georgia, she said, and her voice was level as horizon line, steady as someone who'd already decided what she was willing to lose. As she spoke, her free hand moved to her jacket, still draped across a nearby shelf where she'd left it during her shift. Her fingers found the inside seam, felt the faded unit patch sewn into the lining 8 months ago. The patch she'd stitched herself using a needle and thread from the break room, back when she still believed in the idea of carrying proof that she'd existed. That she'd mattered. That before this grocery store and Gerald Sterling and the careful erasure of everything she'd been someone. The old man's grip on her wrist loosened but didn't release. You were wearing the same boots, he whispered. Issued Dana Reconf. I'd know those laces anywhere. We all had them. Chagazay. The ambulance sirens were getting closer now, wailing down Victory Drive like a warning. Around them, the grocery store had gone quiet, that specific kind of quiet where everyone suddenly understands they're witnessing something larger than themselves. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their constant electric song, and Danielle realized that in 30 seconds, paramedics would arrive. They would take this man. They would ask questions. And somewhere in the next few hours, someone would start putting pieces together that she'd spent 8 months trying to keep scattered. She withdrew the needle carefully, applied pressure with her palm, locked eyes with the Army Ranger one more time. Elevate your arm, she said. Keep pressure on it until the ambulance arrives. You're going to be fine. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that her hands were shaking now, not from fear, not from the crisis that had just resolved, but from the weight of what had just been seen. Not all shaking was fear. Some of it was recognition. Some of it was the trembling of walls built so carefully that you almost forgot they were walls, crumbling because one man had remembered her boots. Within 48 hours, Gerald Sterling made 7 phone calls. The district manager first, voice crisp and practiced. Inventory discrepancies. 17 items unaccounted for in the past month. Danielle's shift. Her access codes. No evidence yet, but concerning patterns. The district manager promised an audit. Sterling then called the property management company handling Danielle's apartment, a carefully worded conversation about a tenant he was concerned about, hints of suspicious activity, nothing he could prove but enough to flag her file for review. An eviction notice took 3 business days to process. He brought in a corporate investigator on day 2, a man with cold eyes and a camera, asking Sterling to review Morrison surveillance footage with particular attention to the back stockroom, the break room, the employee lockers. Theft concerns. Nothing specific, just a pattern he'd noticed. The investigator made notes. Sterling watched the footage 3 times, creating a narrative from nothing. The investigator left with a promise to return with findings. Danielle worked her shift that evening unaware. Restocking shelves at Morrison's grocery, and moving through muscle memory while her mind was somewhere else, still at that moment in aisle 3 when she'd felt the Army Ranger's wrist go limp beneath her fingers, when she'd known exactly what was happening inside his chest cavity before the monitor could confirm it. She'd done a pericardiocentesis with a sewing needle and fishing line. She'd pulled fluid from around his heart with materials meant for craft projects. Her hands had remembered 17 years of field medicine in Helmand Province, muscle memory that transcended time and cover and the careful invisibility she'd constructed at a grocery store in Savannah. Sterling found her on the sales floor at 9:56 p.m., during the evening shift changeover. He had the district manager with him. 2 men. The district manager carried a folder. Sterling's face was a sculpture of manufactured concern. "Danielle. We need to talk." She turned from the shelf, hands still holding cereal boxes. "Now." "My office." The walk took 90 seconds. Long enough for the evening shift to notice. Long enough for the stockroom crew to fall silent as they passed. The office smelled like industrial coffee and the faint copper of old paperwork. Sterling sat behind his desk. The district manager stood. Danielle remained standing. "We found serious discrepancies," Sterling began. "Inventory shortages. Unauthorized access to restricted areas. Questions about your conduct with customers." The district manager opened the folder. Printouts. Her badge number accessing the back stockroom at 5:33 a.m. Her signature on the employee log dated 3 weeks ago. Highlighted sections. Nothing actually incriminating, but arranged to suggest pattern, intent, criminal carelessness. "What are you talking about?" Danielle's voice remained level. "The items are missing, Ms. Ross. Your access logs are inconsistent. We have questions." "I haven't taken anything." "That's not what the evidence suggests," the district manager said. His tone was bureaucratic, already decided. "Given the severity and the liability Morrison's faces, we're going to need your badge and your keys. Effective immediately, you're terminated for theft and policy violations." One breath. Measured. Controlled. Sterling stood. He had prepared for this moment, rehearsed it probably. "You've violated professional boundaries repeatedly. You overstepped your position. You practiced medicine in our store without a license. There are consequences for delusions of grandeur. You're done here." He cut her badge in half with scissors. 2 pieces falling onto his desk like severed things. Danielle watched them land. She saw her own face in the laminate, unsmiling, official, now useless. One tear escaped down her cheek. Just one. She wiped it without breaking eye contact, without flinching, her hand moving with the same precision she'd used to insert that needle into the ranger's chest. She did not tremble. She did not speak. She simply removed her name tag and placed it on the desk beside the badge halves. "Anything else?" she asked. Sterling blinked, unprepared for the absence of resistance. He had expected tears or anger or begging. Quiet dignity was somehow worse. It made him feel smaller. "Clear your locker. Be off the premises in 15 minutes. The evening shift had gathered in the break room by the time she reached it. They watched her walk past without speaking. Nobody met her eyes. Not because they blamed her, most of them had heard Sterling's lectures about maintaining distance, but because looking at her now meant acknowledging complicity. They scattered. She opened her locker, removed the single sweatshirt she'd stored there, the lunch bag nobody had stolen, the jacket she'd been issued on her first day. She checked the pockets. Found nothing. But when she reached to unfold it, her fingers touched the interior lining, the place where she'd stitched a small patch 8 years ago, so faded the colors had nearly erased themselves. A unit insignia from Helmand Province. Marine Corps emblem with the years 2007 to 2015 stitched beneath in pale thread. Her hands. She left it in place. Some anchors you don't abandon even when everything else is pulled from the water. The rain started at 11:13 p.m. Not drizzle, hard, driving rain that hit the pavement of Bonaventure Cemetery in sheets, soaking through her clothes in seconds. Danielle knelt at Marcus's grave in the storm, water running down her face, her hands pressed against the wet stone. The gravestone read his name and his dates and nothing else. Nothing about what he'd been, what they'd been together, the life they'd planned that had ended in a helicopter crash 17 years ago in a country she'd been officially forbidden from ever mentioning. "I failed, Marcus," she whispered. The rain hammered around them. "I stayed invisible like they ordered. I didn't surface. I didn't try to reclaim anything. I pushed carts and stocked shelves and I still lost everything. A car passed on the distant road, headlights cutting through the dark. She watched them move across the cemetery and disappear. The rain fell harder. Her hands were shaking, but not from cold. From something worse, the knowledge that 17 years of discipline, 17 years of keeping Marcus's memory protected by erasing herself from the world, had been for nothing. Sterling had erased her anyway. One man with a phone and a folder had undone everything. She almost threw the jacket away. Stood there with it in her hands, thinking how simple it would be to leave it on the grave, let the rain destroy it, let the unit patch dissolve back into thread and water and nothing. Let Danielle Ross, Senior Chief Petty Officer, Combat Medic, the woman who'd held 17-hour field surgeries in Helmand Province under fire, finally disappear completely. The woman at the grocery store was already gone. Why not finish it? She held the jacket over the trash bin at the cemetery entrance. 100% polyester, hardly meant to survive this kind of rain anyway. It was almost merciful. But her hands didn't let go. Because her son Cameron was 17 now. He would be 17 tomorrow, and the day after that, and for the rest of her life. And someday he would ask why she'd become nothing. Someday he would want to know why his mother had chosen invisible over alive. The rain hammered the asphalt. And then she heard it. Distant at first, barely audible beneath the storm. A sound like the sky breaking open. The rhythmic pulse of rotor blades. Getting closer. One helicopter, then two, then three. The rain seemed to pause in the presence of that sound, as if even weather deferred to the military. Sacred Heart Hospital's emergency landing pad was exactly 2 miles from Bonaventure Cemetery. Danielle looked up at the sound. The jacket still in her hands, the unit patch still sewn inside the lining, the faded colors that nobody but her could read in the dark. She had no idea what was about to walk through those hospital doors. The helicopters descended on Sacred Heart at 11:38 p.m. 3 Black Hawks. Military designation markings visible even in the rain-soaked night. The rotor wash shook the windows of the trauma unit. Staff scattered to secure equipment and charts. No announcement had come through, not through official channels anyway. Just the sound of boots hitting the pad, military boots, lots of them, moving with the synchronized precision that only 17 years in the field could teach. Danielle stood in her apartment, still holding the wet jacket, water pooling on the linoleum. The television was off. Her phone was off. She was standing in the dark with nothing but the sound of those rotors fading into distance and the knowledge that something had shifted in the universe without her permission. At Sacred Heart, in a private room just past the trauma unit, the Army Ranger, the man she'd rescued 3 days earlier, the man who'd recognized her, opened his eyes. The nurses had told him he'd suffered a spontaneous pneumothorax, a collapsed lung, that a hospital employee had performed emergency treatment that saved his life. They had not told him who she was. When the man asked for her, when he asked specifically for the young woman in the grocery store uniform who'd known exactly where to put a needle into his chest, the nursing supervisor had looked confused. The employee? She doesn't work here. She works at Morrison's grocery on Victory Drive. The ranger made a phone call. One call. To a number he'd been given years ago for exactly this kind of emergency. A satellite phone hidden in his hospital room, retrieved from the visitor's chair by someone who understood the gravity of what he was asking for. I found her, he'd said. I found Angel 6. Cameron pushed through the glass doors of Morrison's corporate office at 8:02 a.m., rain still dripping from his shoulders. 16 years old. No appointment. A shadow box tucked under one arm like a football. The security guard looked up from his desk, started to say something, but Cameron was already moving. I need to speak to whoever fired my mother yesterday. His voice didn't shake. It shouldn't have. He'd spent the entire night memorizing what was in that box, understanding for the first time why his mother had kept it wrapped in dark cloth at the back of her closet, why she touched it only on the anniversary she thought he was asleep. The regional director, a man named Hutchins with a silk tie and the soft hands of someone who'd never done anything but make phone calls, opened the shadow box in his office. For minutes later, his face had lost all color. The medals caught the fluorescent light like small accusations. 2 silver stars. For bronze stars with valor. Ribbons in colors he didn't recognize. And there, in the center, the Navy Cross, the medal that had no business belonging to someone stacking shells in Savannah, Georgia. Senior Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy, Cameron said quietly. That's my mother's actual rank. The door opened without a knock. A man in dress blues, decorations clustered on his chest like a garden of thorns, moved into the room with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. A Navy SEAL commander. His name tag read Graves. His eyes found the shadow box the way a hunter finds movement in tall grass. When he spoke, his voice came out like a tank idling in a cold garage, controlled, lethal, patient. Bronze star with valor, he said, pointing. The director's hands trembled. Combat Medical Operations, Helm and Province. Second bronze star. Field surgery under sustained small arms fire. Third bronze star, he paused. The silence stretched. Triage decisions that saved 47 lives in a single 8-hour rotation at FOB Chagazay. His finger moved to the silver star. 2 of these. The first for emergency needle decompression on a fellow medic with a penetrating chest wound. No anesthesia. No backup. 23 minutes of surgical precision under conditions that would have broken most people. The second silver star got its own breath. 14 wounded, 1 facility, 11 hours alone while her unit was pinned down 3 kilometers northeast. She held that field hospital together with her hands and her will while rounds came through the walls. Hutchins couldn't look away from the box. His mouth moved but nothing came out. And this? Graves touched the Navy Cross, the ribbon so dark blue it looked like midnight. Actions in Helm and Province. A Taliban ambush on a convoy carrying 8 wounded personnel. Senior Chief Petty Officer Ross was the only medical provider within 30 kilometers. She performed an emergency pericardiocentesis on a soldier in hemorrhagic shock using a 14-gauge needle and a syringe. Needle in between the ribs. Cardiac tamponade draining. Sinus rhythm restored. Patient survived. That soldier is alive today because your employee, the one you fired yesterday, understands medicine at a level that most of your doctors will never reach. The director's chair rolled backward involuntarily. I didn't know. We had no information about. Of course you didn't, Graves said. Because Senior Chief Petty Officer Ross was ordered to disappear. After Operation Copper June went wrong, after the extraction in Helmand that was supposed to stay classified forever, the Pentagon buried her records. She was told her old life was over. That the woman she'd been before was officially dead. No hospitals. No military work. No trace. Just vanish into civilian life and stay invisible. He closed the shadow box. The click sounded like a handcuff locking. She followed orders. She kept her mouth shut. She took a job stacking shells because that's what she was told to do, and warriors don't break orders even when those orders destroy them. The silence in that office was the kind that happens right before something terrible. The FBI liaison walked in next, badge already in hand, her face a professional blank. Behind her came a second agent, and between them both was a tension that made the air feel sharp. The classification on Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross's service record has been lifted by executive order, she said. As of 4:13 a.m. this morning. The individual she saved at Morrison's grocery, the one you called the police on, has ties to the president's office. When he explained what she'd done for him, when he told the White House that your employee saved his life using skills that shouldn't exist outside a trauma bay, certain conversations happened in certain places. She set a folder on the desk. Your company's surveillance footage for the last 8 months has been subpoenaed. Your communications with the district manager. Your calls to the apartment leasing office. Your request for a corporate investigator. All of it. And every single bit of it is being reviewed by federal agents who are very interested in employment discrimination, witness intimidation, and potential violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act, because Senior Chief Petty Officer Ross's medical expertise was, in fact, a protected disclosure of prior military service. Dr. Sterling didn't come in himself. He couldn't have. Security had already escorted him from the building 14 minutes earlier, while local news cameras, tipped off by the president's staff, because why waste an opportunity, captured every second. Him in his white coat. Him in handcuffs. Him being placed in the back of a federal vehicle while nurses stood in the parking lot watching the man who'd made their lives hell get loaded into a car like cargo. The cameras caught Sterling's face as the Navy investigator read him his rights. Caught him trying to explain. Caught him understanding, too late, that he'd spent 6 months destroying a decorated military officer for the crime of being better at medicine than he would ever be. 6 months later, Sacred Heart Hospital had a new division. Veterans Medical Outreach Program. Director, Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross, though she went by her civilian name now. Her office faced the courtyard where she could see the rain coming before it hit the windows. A pro bono trauma wing had been added, 42 beds dedicated to military personnel and their families. No insurance required. No questions asked. The hospital had learned what happens when you ignore greatness standing in front of you. Dr. Sterling taught CPR at Savannah Technical College. Part-time contract. $15 an hour, which meant he worked 2 other jobs to keep his apartment. The name tag at the community college said Stephen Sterling, which meant nobody called him doctor anymore. Not once. When someone occasionally recognized him from the news, from the federal charges that had been dropped only because of a settlement and a non-disclosure agreement he'd been forced to sign, they looked at him the way people look at accidents they can't unsee. He flinched. Every single time, he flinched. Cameron stood in his mother's office at 3:22 p.m., placing the shadow box on her desk beside a framed photograph. The photo showed Danielle in uniform, young and steady, her arm around a man in marine dress blues. That was Marcus. That was the grave where she'd knelt in the rain and told her dead husband she'd failed. The faded unit patch, the one that had been hidden in her jacket lining for 7 years, was finally displayed where it belonged. Not hidden. Not shameful. Not something to whisper about. A patch that meant she'd earned her place at the table, and no one, ever again, would make her feel small for knowing how to save lives. Danielle came in at 3:51 p.m., wearing scrubs instead of a suit, because that's who she was. A trauma surgeon in everything but title. She saw the box on her desk. Saw her son standing beside it. Saw the photograph. For exactly 3 seconds, she didn't move. Then she stepped toward Cameron, and he moved toward her, and they didn't hug, that wasn't their way, but he took her hand, and she squeezed it hard enough that he understood what she couldn't say in words. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. 7 years of restraint finally released. The next evening, Danielle was in the ICU checking vitals on a post-op patient, her hands moving through the practiced choreography of assessment, pulse, temperature, medication names, dosages, when a young surgeon watched from the doorway. The way residents watched her now. Not with dismissal. With attention. With the understanding that the quiet nurse in scrubs who could read a patient's decline from 50 yards away was the most dangerous person in the room, and they meant dangerous in the way that kept people alive. She would be offered the chief medical officer position in 3 weeks. She would turn it down. Her fight was here, she told the board, in scrubs, with her hands, in the moments when one decision separated recovery from disaster. Power wasn't a title. Power was the ability to stand between a patient and oblivion. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. What would you have done if you were in Cameron's position? Would you have told the truth about your mother or protected her secret? Like this video if you support our troops. And if you or someone you love has served, let us know in the comments, we'd be honored to hear from you. Subscribe and let's get back to the story.